The Invisible Killer: How a Tiny Radio Tube Ended Hitler's Last Gamble in the Ardennes. You are probably already familiar with the Battle of the Bulge, or at least you think you are. Most people know it through the American story. The frozen forests of the Ardennes, the desperate stand at Bastogne, young GIs cut off and surrounded, refusing to surrender, and the dramatic relief effort led by George S. Patton, turning an entire army north through ice-choked roads in one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war. These stories have become part of American legend, and rightly so. They speak to endurance, discipline, and courage under conditions that tested human limits. But there is another side to this battle, a side that is rarely told. In December 1944, as snow fell thick across Belgium and Luxembourg, something small helped decide the fate of Hitler's last great gamble. Something no larger than a walnut, no tank, no aircraft, no new division. It was a device hidden inside an artillery shell. Its official name was the VT Proximity Fuse, short for Variable Time Fuse. And when it appeared over the Ardennes battlefield, it changed the rules of survival in a way German soldiers were completely unprepared for. Until then, artillery followed patterns the German army understood very well. German infantry had survived years of bombardment on the Eastern Front and in Italy. They had learned, through brutal experience, how to stay alive when shells began to fall. Dig deep. Lie flat. Let the shell bury itself in the earth. Trust the ground to absorb most of the blast and fragments. When the explosion came, endure it, then get up and keep fighting. That knowledge had kept thousands of men alive. The VT fuse erased it in an instant. Instead of exploding on impact, American artillery shells now detonated in mid-air, several meters above the ground. The blast no longer traveled outward into the soil. It went downward. Steel fragments rained vertically into foxholes, trenches, and behind trees, into the very places soldiers believed were safest. There was no warning, no new sound to recognize, no new tactic to learn in time. Foxholes became death traps. To be absolutely clear, this story is not about sympathy for the Nazi regime or the cause its soldiers served. That cause was criminal. Many of the men who fought under its banner committed or supported terrible crimes. None of that is minimized here. But understanding what happened in the Ardennes from the German perspective matters, because it shows just how decisive American scientific innovation and industrial power had become by the end of the war. It shows how experience, courage, and even fanaticism could be rendered ineffective by a technological leap the enemy could not counter. For the Allies, D-Day became a heroic epic. For the Germans, the romance vanished. The same is true in the Ardennes. We know the American side well. The German experience, what it felt like to advance confidently into the forest, only to be torn apart by an invisible enemy they could neither see nor avoid, remains largely untold. So let us tell that story now. Let us see why German units, hardened by years of combat, suddenly began to break. Let us understand how a tiny radio tube, a simple circuit, and mass American production turned ordinary artillery into a silent executioner. Let us explore how an invisible killer helped stop Hitler's final offensive when tanks, weather, and manpower alone could not. If you want history told slowly, carefully, and honestly, beyond the familiar legends, follow Beyond History. Subscribe and stay with us, because this story is not just about weapons or tactics. It is about how modern war reached a point where survival itself depended on forces soldiers could no longer see, predict, or escape. This is the Battle of the Bulge, seen from the other side of the explosion. The desperate gamble. By the autumn of 1944, Nazi Germany was no longer losing the war, it was dying. In the east, Soviet armies were grinding relentlessly westward through Poland, destroying entire German formations in battles of annihilation. In the west, American and British forces had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and were now pressing toward Germany's borders. The Luftwaffe had been shattered. Allied bombers roamed German skies almost at will, turning cities, factories, and rail hubs into smoking ruins. The Reich's military strength was bleeding away faster than it could be replaced. From the perspective of most of Germany's generals, the strategic situation was hopeless. But Adolf Hitler refused to accept that reality. Hitler's thinking had become increasingly detached from the material facts of the war. He no longer believed defeat was inevitable. Instead, he convinced himself that Germany's enemies, especially in the West, were politically fragile. The alliance between the United States and Britain, he believed, was one of convenience rather than conviction. If he could deliver a single, shocking blow, one catastrophic defeat that humiliated the Western Allies and shattered their confidence, perhaps they would negotiate rather than continue fighting. That belief gave birth to Operation Watch am Rhein. The plan was audacious to the point of fantasy. German forces would launch a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes, the same rugged, forested terrain they had exploited in 1940 to defeat France. They would smash through thinly held American lines, cross the Meuse River, and drive northwest all the way to Antwerp, the single most important Allied supply port in Western Europe. If Antwerp fell, Allied logistics would collapse. American and British armies would be split apart. The front would fracture. In Hitler's imagination, the shock might be so severe that the Western Allies would lose the will to fight. But this vision rested on three fragile pillars: speed, weather, and fuel. Speed was essential because time favored the Allies. Every additional day of fighting would allow American and British commanders to move reserves, reorganize shattered units, and bring overwhelming firepower to bear. The offensive had to move faster than Allied decision-making. Weather was equally critical. The German army had learned a hard lesson in 1944. Whenever the skies cleared, Allied aircraft destroyed columns of vehicles, tanks, and troops with terrifying efficiency. Thick winter clouds over the Ardennes might ground Allied air power and give German forces a brief window of freedom. And then there was fuel, the most dangerous weakness of all. By December 1944, the German war machine was running on fumes. Allied bombing had crippled Germany's synthetic fuel plants, which produced gasoline from coal. The loss of the Romanian oil fields earlier in the year had removed one of Germany's last natural sources of petroleum. Training had been curtailed. Luftwaffe pilots were flying fewer hours. Tank units often lacked enough fuel to maneuver even in defensive operations. The Ardennes offensive demanded enormous quantities of gasoline, far more than Germany actually possessed. Hitler's solution was as desperate as it was unrealistic. Capture Allied fuel dumps along the route of advance. German planners assumed that American depots would be seized intact, providing the fuel needed to keep the offensive moving. Without that captured fuel, the attack would stall long before reaching Antwerp, perhaps before even crossing the Meuse. In reality, this was not a plan grounded in logistics. It was a gamble built on hope. Many German commanders understood the risks. Some privately doubted the offensive could succeed even under ideal conditions. But dissent no longer mattered. Hitler had committed Germany's last strategic reserves, its remaining panzer divisions, elite infantry, and stockpiled equipment, to this final throw of the dice. There would be no second chance. On December 16, 1944, under cover of darkness, fog, and falling snow, German artillery opened fire across the Ardennes front. Infantry moved forward through frozen forests. Tanks began rolling westward once more. The dice were cast. What followed would become the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last great offensive, born of desperation, illusion, and a profound misunderstanding of the forces now arrayed against him. The commander and his army. The man responsible for the northern sector of the offensive was Joseph Dietrich, known to almost everyone, friend and enemy alike, as Sepp Dietrich. He was not a typical German general. Dietrich had not passed through the Prussian officer academies or absorbed the traditions of the old general staff. He did not speak the polished language of operational theory or staff planning. His education came instead from the mud and terror of the First World War trenches, and later from the violent street fighting and political chaos of post-war Germany. Before the war, Dietrich had been a butcher's apprentice. When Germany collapsed in 1918, he returned to a country shattered by defeat, humiliation, and economic ruin. Like many men who felt discarded by that collapse, he found purpose in extremism. He joined the Nazi Party early, became one of Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguards, and built his career not on formal training, but on absolute loyalty. Dietrich's rise through the SS was fueled by three qualities: physical courage, personal aggression, and unwavering devotion to Hitler. These traits mattered more in the SS than tactical brilliance. By 1944, that loyalty had carried him to command one of the most powerful formations Germany still possessed. He now led the 6th SS Panzer Army, the spearhead of the Ardennes offensive in the north. Under Dietrich's authority were some of the Reich's most notorious units, including the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. The 12th SS was a deeply unsettling creation. Its enlisted ranks were filled with young men, many still teenagers, who had grown up entirely inside the Nazi system. They had known no other world view. From childhood onward, they had been immersed in propaganda that glorified racial struggle, absolute obedience, and the idea that dying for the fatherland was the highest form of achievement. Their officers were veterans, many hardened by years of fighting on the Eastern Front. But the ordinary soldiers were boys, trained aggressively, disciplined harshly, and taught to see the enemy not as fellow human beings, but as racial and ideological opponents. They had been told that American soldiers were weak, undisciplined, and unwilling to endure hardship. And they believed it, because they had been trained to believe it. On paper, Dietrich's force looked formidable. Panthers and Tigers, elite SS infantry, veterans of Normandy and the Eastern Front. In Hitler's imagination, this army would smash through the northern Ardennes, seize key road junctions, and race westward towards the Meuse. Reality was less forgiving. The Ardennes was not open country. Its roads were narrow, winding, and often barely wide enough for a single tank. Steep banks, dense forests, and small villages turned every movement into a bottleneck. Even before the first American shot was fired, German columns were backing up for miles. Fuel consumption loomed over every calculation. Tanks burned gasoline at an alarming rate, especially in winter conditions. Every delay increased the chance that vehicles would simply run dry by the roadside. Officers understood the arithmetic of distance versus fuel, and it did not favor them. Even within the SS, there was quiet unease. The army had the men, it had the tanks. What it did not truly have was the time and fuel needed to turn ambition into reality. Dietrich, however, was not a man who voiced doubts openly. His role was not to question Hitler's vision, but to execute it with maximum force. Whatever private misgivings he may have had about terrain, logistics, or fuel, he kept them to himself. Loyalty demanded action. In the early hours of December 16th, 1944, under cover of darkness, fog, and falling snow, Dietrich's guns opened fire. Infantry moved forward through frozen forests. Tanks began inching westward along narrow roads already clogged with traffic. For the men of the 6th SS Panzer Army, especially the young soldiers of the Hitlerjugend, this was to be the moment they had been prepared for their entire lives. What they did not yet understand was that they were advancing into a battlefield, transformed by forces they could not see, could not hear, and could not fight in the way they had been trained to fight. The offensive had begun, and the margin for error was already gone. The protecting fog. In the days before the offensive began, nature itself seemed to take the German side. A thick, freezing fog settled over the Ardennes and refused to lift. It crept through the valleys, wrapped itself around the trees, and clung to the narrow roads like a living thing. The sky turned a dull, oppressive grey, pressing down on the forest as if sealed shut. Visibility shrank to a few dozen yards. Sound carried strangely. Columns moved forward, feeling blind and enclosed, as if the world had narrowed to the width of the road ahead. For the German army, this fog felt like a miracle. It meant Allied aircraft could not fly. For months, German soldiers had learned to fear clear skies more than enemy infantry. Whenever clouds parted, American and British fighter bombers appeared overhead, hunting vehicles, tanks, and marching columns with merciless efficiency. Roads turned into killing grounds. Any movement in daylight invited destruction from above. Now, for once, the skies were empty. German soldiers had a bitter joke that captured the reality of the air war perfectly. If you see a white plane, it is American. If you see a black plane, it is British. If you see no planes at all, it is the Luftwaffe. The joke drew laughter, but it also acknowledged a painful truth. German air power had been virtually annihilated. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and Allied numerical superiority had reduced the Luftwaffe to a shadow of its former self. Control of the air belonged completely to the Allies, when weather allowed. In mid-December 1944, weather did not allow it. For the first time in months, German columns could move during daylight without being immediately torn apart from the air. Tanks rolled forward without fear of rocket attack. Infantry advanced through forest trails without the scream of diving aircraft overhead. To exhausted, frost-bitten soldiers, the fog felt like protection. German officers leaned heavily on this advantage. They told their men that the Americans were helpless without air support, that American confidence depended on aircraft, artillery, and supplies rather than real fighting spirit. They insisted that once surprise and momentum were achieved, German courage and experience would overwhelm an enemy they portrayed as comfortable, undisciplined, and unwilling to endure hardship. Among the young soldiers of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, these words landed easily. Many of them had grown up entirely within Nazi ideology. They had been taught from childhood that material wealth made societies weak, that true strength came from belief, obedience, and sacrifice. They had been trained to see themselves as harder, purer, and more committed than their enemies. The fog seemed to confirm everything they had been told. The Americans, they believed, were blind. What none of them understood, not officers, not veterans, not the indoctrinated teenagers moving through the forest, was that the fog concealed something far more dangerous than aircraft. While German troops advanced through the Ardennes under nature's cover, American supply depots far behind the front were quietly preparing a weapon the Germans had never encountered in combat. Artillery shells were being fitted with a new kind of fuse, a device that did not rely on impact or timing, a device that did not care about fog, darkness, or visibility. An invisible killer, sealed inside steel casings, waiting patiently for the moment when German infantry would step into its reach. The fog did not hide the danger. It delayed its arrival, just long enough for the shock to be complete when it finally came. The attack begins. On December 16, 1944, just before dawn, the Ardennes erupted. Without warning, German artillery opened fire along a front stretching more than 80 miles. The bombardment rolled through the frozen forest like distant thunder, shells crashing into American positions hidden by darkness and fog. Almost immediately, infantry began moving forward, ghostly figures emerging from the trees, followed by tanks grinding along narrow forest roads slick with ice and mud. For the men advancing west, this was the long-awaited moment. Surprise had been achieved. The weather favored them. The enemy, they believed, was unprepared. At the northern edge of the offensive, the main blow fell on the 99th Infantry Division. On paper, the choice seemed perfect. The 99th had arrived in Europe only weeks earlier. It had never seen large-scale combat. Its soldiers were young, many barely out of training, men who had prepared for war in the United States and expected a quiet period of acclimation before being tested. They now found themselves facing elite formations of the 6th SS Panzer Army, including veteran SS units hardened by years of brutal fighting. The odds could not have looked more favorable to the attackers. The Americans were surprised. They were outnumbered. They were spread thin across difficult terrain. German planners expected collapse. That collapse never came. Instead, something deeply unsettling began to unfold from the German point of view. The soldiers of the 99th Division began to fight back, not with reckless counterattacks, but with stubborn discipline. Small units held ridgelines longer than expected. Patrols delayed advances at road junctions. Isolated platoons fought until ordered to pull back, then disengaged without panic. They did not run. They did not disintegrate. They did exactly what they had been trained to do. When pressure became overwhelming, they withdrew, but in good order. They fell back to higher ground, dug in, and waited. When those positions became untenable, they repeated the process again. Foxholes appeared on successive ridges. Machine guns were repositioned. Commanders maintained control. Messengers moved through shellfire. Unit cohesion held. To German officers watching the advance unfold, this behavior was unexpected and dangerous. Every hour of resistance mattered. Every delay multiplied the strain on German logistics. The Ardennes road network, never designed for heavy mechanized traffic, began to clog almost immediately. Tanks queued behind trucks. Fuel convoys backed up. Artillery struggled to move forward. The very terrain that had promised concealment now imposed friction. The offensive had been planned around speed. Speed was already slipping away. German casualties mounted faster than anticipated. American defensive fires were heavier and more coordinated than expected. Positions thought to be lightly held turned into hard points that required time and lives to overcome. The confidence of the opening hours began to fade, replaced by irritation and then concern. The grand timetable drawn up at headquarters no longer matched reality on the ground. What was supposed to be a rapid penetration was turning into a series of costly incremental advances. The fog still protected German movement from the air, but it could not fix traffic jams, shorten distances, or replace fuel that did not exist. Before the first day was over, the magnificent offensive had already begun to stumble. Not because the Americans were stronger, not because they had more men, but because they refused to break when they were supposed to. For German planners, this was the first warning sign. The Ardennes offensive was not collapsing, but it was no longer unfolding as planned. And in a battle that depended on momentum above all else, even small delays carried enormous consequences. The snow kept falling. The fog held. And somewhere beyond the trees, American artillery was preparing a response the Germans had never experienced before. The twins who held the line. Among the thousands of American soldiers defending Elsenborn Ridge, there were moments and personal stories that would later harden into legend. One of those stories spoke of twin brothers from a small town in Pennsylvania, who by chance and circumstance found themselves crouched in the same foxhole as the German assault rolled toward them through the fog. Whether remembered in perfect detail or shaped by time, the story captured something real about those days. Men who never expected to fight together, suddenly depending on one another for survival. The backbone of the defense was the 99th Infantry Division. It was a division that looked vulnerable on paper. Many of its soldiers were fresh from training camps, young men who had crossed the Atlantic only weeks earlier. They had not fought in Normandy. They had not broken out at Saint-Lô. They had not raced across France. Their expectation was modest: to learn, to acclimate, to endure a quiet winter sector while gaining experience. They had expected, perhaps, to spend Christmas adjusting to the cold. Instead, they found themselves standing directly in the path of Hitler's last gamble. What made the American defense at Elsenborn Ridge remarkable was not simply bravery, though bravery was everywhere. It was discipline under shock. German planners had assumed that green American units, hit suddenly and hard, would disintegrate. That men without combat experience would scatter, clog roads, and open gaps wide enough for panzer columns to surge through. That assumption proved wrong. When German units pushed forward, they encountered resistance that behaved like a veteran force. Platoon leaders kept their men together, even as shells burst nearby. Squad leaders redistributed ammunition and repositioned weapons under fire. Company commanders maintained contact with battalion headquarters despite disrupted lines and confused reports. Even when individual foxholes were overrun, the units as a whole did not collapse. They bent, but they did not break. The terrain around Elsenborn Ridge amplified that discipline. The ridge itself dominated the surrounding countryside, offering commanding fields of fire over the approaches the Germans needed to use. The forests provided concealment for American movements, allowing units to shift positions without being easily observed. And the narrow roads threading through the Ardennes became natural choke points, places where attacking forces had to compress, slow down, and expose themselves. American artillery began to exploit this geography. Though snow, forest cover, and poor visibility limited its effectiveness at first, the guns gradually found their ranges. German assembly areas were shelled repeatedly. Columns attempting to form up were disrupted. Attacks lost coordination before they ever reached American lines. Every delay cost the Germans fuel, momentum, and irreplaceable manpower. For 8 days, from December 16th through December 24th, this brutal rhythm continued. German forces attacked. American units yielded ground deliberately. Then the Americans dug in again, often on higher, stronger positions. Each withdrawal was measured. Each stand was costly. The defenders made the attackers pay for every yard of frozen forest and snow-covered field. There were no sweeping counterattacks, no dramatic charges, just stubborn resistance repeated again and again under conditions that tested physical endurance and mental resilience to the breaking point. From the German side, frustration mounted quickly. This was not how the offensive was supposed to unfold. The timetable assumed rapid breakthroughs, not drawn-out fights against supposedly inexperienced troops. Each day lost at Elsenborn Ridge rippled outward, disrupting plans across the entire northern sector. Fuel consumption increased. Traffic jams worsened. Reserves meant to exploit success were instead pulled into grinding frontal combat. Most dangerously of all, time was slipping away. German commanders had expected American morale to crack. They had expected fear, panic, and collapse. What they encountered instead was something far more dangerous: soldiers who stayed, who adapted, and who learned under fire. By Christmas Eve, the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The offensive had not failed, but it was no longer racing forward. And in a battle where speed was everything, stubborn American resistance at Elsenborn Ridge was quietly bleeding the German plan to death. What neither side yet fully understood was that this stubborn stand was only the beginning, and that the battlefield itself was about to become far more lethal than anyone on the German side imagined. The physics they thought they knew. Despite the slowing advance, German soldiers remained confident about one thing above all else. They knew how to survive artillery. This confidence was not arrogance, it was experience, earned the hardest way possible over 4 years of continuous warfare. German infantrymen had fought under artillery on the Eastern Front, in Italy, in Normandy. They had learned, through wounds, losses, and bitter repetition, how shells behaved and how men stayed alive when the barrage began. In dense forest terrain, they believed, artillery was far less deadly than it appeared. The reasoning was grounded in simple physics. Most conventional artillery shells used impact fuses. They detonated when they struck something solid: rock, packed earth, a road surface. In open ground, this could be devastating. But in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, shells often behaved differently. They plunged into soft earth, leaf litter, and snow before exploding. When that happened, the explosion was muffled. Much of the blast energy went downward into the ground rather than outward into the air. Shrapnel spread mostly sideways, not vertically. Trees absorbed fragments. Terrain disrupted blast waves. A soldier lying flat in a foxhole, below ground level, was relatively protected from horizontal fragments. Veterans understood this instinctively. When incoming rounds were heard, they dropped into cover. They waited. They listened for the dull, buried thump of a shell detonating underground rather than the sharper crack of an airburst. When the explosions ended, they climbed out and continued moving forward. This method had worked, again and again. It had worked in Russian forests, it had worked in muddy fields, it had worked in Normandy hedgerows. Foxholes, dug deep and used correctly, had saved lives. Entire units had survived barrages that looked annihilating from a distance, but proved survivable to men who understood how to position themselves and endure. German soldiers trusted this knowledge because it had kept them alive. They believed artillery was frightening, exhausting, and disruptive, but not decisive. Something to be endured rather than feared. Something that slowed advances but rarely destroyed determined infantry in forest terrain. That belief shaped behavior. Men stayed in foxholes rather than scattering. They hugged the ground instead of running. They waited out bombardments instead of panicking. And in most of their past experience, that belief had been correct. What they did not yet understand was that the rules had changed. The shells that were about to arrive would not bury themselves harmlessly in the earth. They would not send fragments skimming sideways through trees. They would not reward experience learned in earlier years of the war. The knowledge that had kept these men alive, knowledge they trusted completely, was about to become a fatal liability. Because the next artillery barrage would not explode in the ground, it would explode above it. The secret weapon. While German soldiers learned to survive artillery in Russia and France, something revolutionary was taking shape in Silver Spring, Maryland. The Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory had been working for years on a project so secret that only a handful of leaders knew it existed. The device was called the VT fuse, the proximity fuse, or variable time fuse. It looked almost identical to a standard artillery fuse. A German examining one would have seen nothing unusual. But inside was something extraordinary. A complete miniature radio transceiver packed into a space the size of a walnut. There was a tiny antenna, a battery that activated only when the shell was fired, and a circuit that could perform a calculation never before possible in a weapon. The principle was the Doppler effect, the same phenomenon that makes an ambulance siren seem to change pitch as it passes. When waves approach, their frequency increases. When they recede, frequency decreases. As a VT-equipped shell descended, it broadcast a radio signal. When that signal struck the ground, it bounced back. Because the shell moved toward the ground, the reflected signal had higher frequency. The circuit monitored this shift. When it reached a specific intensity, indicating the shell was approximately 30 feet above target, the circuit triggered detonation. The shell exploded in midair, not when it hit the ground. The implications were revolutionary. Shrapnel would be driven downward, raining onto anyone below. There would be no horizontal spread pattern soldiers could avoid by lying flat. There would be no safe foxholes. American engineers understood exactly what this meant. They had created a weapon that would make standard infantry tactics obsolete. The birth of a wonder weapon. The story of the VT fuse began not in wartime, but in the years of uneasy peace before the storm. In 1940, as German armies swept across Western Europe, British scientists approached their American counterparts with a desperate request. They needed help developing weapons that could counter the Luftwaffe's bombing raids on British cities. The proximity fuse was one of several technologies that emerged from this collaboration. The concept was simple in theory, but fiendishly difficult in practice. How do you build a radio transmitter small enough to fit inside an artillery shell? How do you make electronic components that can survive being fired from a cannon, experiencing forces of over 20,000 times the force of gravity? How do you create a battery that remains inert during storage but activates instantly when the shell is fired? American engineers at Johns Hopkins solved these problems one by one. They developed miniature vacuum tubes that could withstand enormous stress. They created a wet cell battery that used the spinning motion of the shell to mix its chemicals and generate power. They designed circuits that could calculate distance and timing with remarkable accuracy. By 1943, the VT fuse was ready for combat. The Navy began using it in the Pacific against Japanese aircraft. The results were spectacular. Ships equipped with VT-fused anti-aircraft shells shot down far more enemy planes than those using conventional ammunition. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, American ships using proximity fuses helped destroy over 300 Japanese aircraft in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But on land, in Europe, the fuse remained locked away. The risk of the enemy capturing one was deemed too great. Until December 1944. Why the secret was kept. If the VT fuse was so revolutionary, why had it not been used before December 1944? General Dwight D. Eisenhower recognized both its potential and its risk. If Germans recovered a dud shell and reverse-engineered the technology, they could produce their own proximity fuses. German anti-aircraft guns with VT fuses would become far more deadly against Allied bombers. The advantage would be neutralized or turned against its creators. For this reason, Eisenhower restricted VT fuse use in Europe. The Navy used it in the Pacific against Japanese aircraft because missed shells fell into the ocean where no one could retrieve them. But using VT fuses over land, where unexploded shells could be recovered, was forbidden except in extreme circumstances. The proximity fuse waited in American arsenals for a crisis that would justify revealing it. That moment arrived in December 1944. The decision. By December 23rd, the Ardennes situation remained dangerous. German forces had created a significant bulge in American lines. Some units were surrounded at Bastogne. The overall offensive had stalled short of objectives, but the threat persisted. Then the weather changed. The fog began lifting. Patches of blue sky appeared. But Eisenhower was thinking beyond air power. Intelligence indicated German forces were regrouping for renewed attacks in the northern sector. If those attacks succeeded, the defensive position could unravel. Eisenhower made his decision. The proximity fuse was released for artillery units defending the Ardennes, particularly around Elsenborn Ridge. It was a calculated risk. Some shells would fail to detonate. Some might be recovered. The secret might leak. But the immediate crisis outweighed long-term risk. He released the secret. The war was about to change forever. Christmas Eve morning, December 24th, 1944. Christmas Eve. In German positions, officers organized what they hoped would be a decisive assault. After more than a week of fighting, they still believed breakthrough was possible. The young soldiers of the Hitler Jugend division gathered in the forest preparing to attack. The scene that morning was probably one of controlled chaos. thousands of men in field grey moving between trees, officers checking weapons, sergeants organizing squads. The tension of imminent combat mixed with the anticipation of men who believed this day would bring the breakthrough they had fought for. They had survived artillery before. When shells came, they would find cover. When explosions stopped, they would advance. This was the rhythm of infantry combat that had carried them through years of war. On the American side, forward observers watched German positions through binoculars. They could see movement, concentration of troops, preparations for attack. One observer, positioned on high ground with a clear view, reached for his radio handset. His voice was calm, professional. "Fire mission, battalion concentration, fire for effect." A pause. Then he added words the German army had never heard. "VT in effect." Steel rain. The first shells arrived without warning. Survivors would remember this most clearly. There was no warning. Traditional artillery made a distinctive whistling sound. These shells were already overhead before anyone looked up. And then they did not hit the ground. The shells exploded in the air, perhaps 30 feet up, each creating a burst of fire and smoke and metal that seemed to hang suspended before cascading downward. The explosions came almost simultaneously, a synchronized detonation creating a dome of destruction. The shrapnel did not fly horizontally. It was driven straight down by explosion force, thousands of metal fragments falling at supersonic speeds. The cone of death expanded as it fell, covering wide areas beneath each burst. Men who dropped into foxholes discovered their training had betrayed them. The foxholes were not shelters anymore. They were buckets designed to catch the steel rain falling from above. The German attack collapsed in seconds. Where moments before there had been organized units, now there was chaos. Men screaming, dying, running in every direction. Some stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. Some tried to dig deeper, not understanding that depth could not save them. Radio transmissions became frantic. "The artillery explodes in the sky!" Voices cried. "It falls from above! We cannot hide!" The shell bursts kept coming, each salvo finding targets with terrible precision, VT fuses calculating distance with cold electronic accuracy. One German prisoner reportedly described it simply. "We heard nothing. The shell was already above us when it exploded. One moment a man was breathing. The next moment he was simply gone." The collapse. Reports reaching Dietrich's headquarters were unlike anything German commanders had experienced. They seemed incoherent, impossible to reconcile with military reality. Battalions were melting away without engaging the enemy directly. Companies were being destroyed by something that fell from empty sky. Men were dying in foxholes that had kept soldiers alive through years of warfare. Signal officers reportedly screamed into radios about some new automatic artillery system. Senior officers shouted that this was impossible, that it violated principles of warfare. The chain of command fractured under strain. The 12th SS Panzer Division suffered catastrophic losses during the Ardennes campaign. Historical estimates suggest casualties of 30 to 40% of their strength. Units that faced VT fuse barrages after December 24th were particularly hard hit. Their tanks fared little better. Many were lost to enemy action, mechanical breakdown, and the fuel shortage that had plagued the offensive from the beginning. The force meant to spearhead the drive to Antwerp was being systematically dismantled. The human cost. Behind the statistics of the Ardennes campaign lay individual tragedies beyond counting. On both sides, young men who had been alive on December 16th would never see the new year. The German losses were particularly devastating because they represented the last reserves of trained manpower that Germany possessed. The boys of the Hitlerjugend division had been raised from childhood for this moment. They had been told they were the future of the Reich, the generation that would secure German dominance for 1,000 years. Instead, they died in frozen forests, killed by a weapon they could not see and could not understand. American losses were heavy as well. The 99th Infantry Division, which bore the brunt of the initial assault, suffered over 3,000 casualties during the battle. Many of these young Americans had been in Europe for less than a month. They had written letters home promising to be back soon. They had carried photographs of sweethearts and mothers in their pockets. The difference was that America could absorb these losses and keep fighting. Germany could not. Every man lost in the Ardennes was a man who would not be available to defend Berlin when the Soviets came. Every tank destroyed was a tank that could not be replaced. The mathematics of attrition, which had been working against Germany since 1942, accelerated dramatically in December 1944. The VT fuse was just one factor in this equation, but it was a multiplier that magnified every other advantage the Allies possessed. The complete picture. It would be wrong to suggest the VT fuse alone defeated the German offensive. War is never that simple. The fuel shortage proved as crippling as predicted. German tanks literally ran out of gasoline, sometimes within sight of American fuel dumps. The mighty King Tiger tanks sat immobile because their fuel tanks were empty. When weather cleared, Allied air power returned devastatingly. Fighter bombers swept over German columns, destroying vehicles and disrupting supplies. The Luftwaffe offered only token resistance. American ground forces counterattacked with growing strength. Patton's Third Army drove north to relieve Bastogne. Other units pressed German flanks. The Bulge began shrinking. The combination was fatal to German hopes. Lack of fuel immobilized armor. Air power destroyed what could not move. Ground forces pushed back, and the VT fuse broke infantry concentrations whenever Germans tried massing for attacks. Each factor reinforced the others. Together, they transformed Hitler's last offensive into his last defeat. But among these factors, the VT fuse stands out. It represented something new, a glimpse of future warfare that German forces could not counter. No tactical adjustment, no courage, no determination could protect infantry from shells exploding above their heads. The VT fuse was not the only factor, but it was the clearest symbol of why German courage could not overcome Allied industrial might. The lesson. What did survivors learn from Elsenborn Ridge? The lesson was simple but profound. Courage dies when you cannot see the enemy. Will means nothing when the sky rains steel. Fanaticism becomes just another variable in a physics equation, a number that can be calculated and discarded. General George Patton recognized that artillery innovation proved as decisive as mobile warfare. It was not merely tactical improvement. It was a fundamental shift in how wars would be fought. The young men of the Hitlerjugend had been taught that willpower guaranteed victory, that German courage could overcome material disadvantage. The VT fuse did not care about any of that. It did not recognize ideology. It did not acknowledge sacrifice. It simply processed targets according to mathematical formulas. This was the future of warfare. Wars would increasingly be won not by the bravest soldiers, but by the best technology. Not by the strongest will, but by the most productive factories. Not on battlefields, but in laboratories. Wars are not won by the brave alone. They are won in factories, by the side that can innovate, by the side that can calculate physics faster than courage can pull a trigger. Afterward, Sepp Dietrich survived the Ardennes, though his army did not survive intact. He retreated with remaining forces and never launched another major attack. Germany surrendered in May 1945. Dietrich was captured and eventually faced trial for war crimes related to the Malmedy massacre, in which SS troops under his overall command murdered American prisoners of war during the Ardennes offensive. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, but was released in 1955 after serving only 10 years. He lived until 1966, long enough to see the ideology he served completely discredited. In his later accounts, Dietrich apparently never fully explained what happened at Elsenborn Ridge. Perhaps he did not understand the physics. Perhaps he understood too well. The truth was simpler than any explanation he might have offered. He had lost the battle not when the first VT shells exploded. He had lost it years earlier, in the industrial heartland of a nation he had underestimated, in quiet rooms where engineers solved problems he never knew existed. He had lost it the moment American engineers began calculating how to kill with physics instead of courage. The legacy of the invisible killer. The VT proximity fuse did not vanish when the snow melted in the Ardennes. It stayed, it spread, and it quietly reshaped the rest of the war. In the final months of World War II, the same small device that had shattered German infantry formations in the forests of Belgium found new enemies in the sky. When V-1 flying bomb attacks resumed against London, Allied air defences faced a terrifying problem. The V-1 was fast, small, and difficult to hit. Conventional artillery struggled to bring them down in time. With proximity fuses, that changed. Anti-aircraft guns no longer needed a direct hit. A shell only had to pass close. When it did, the fuse detonated automatically, throwing a lethal cloud of fragments across the missile's flight path. Kill rates rose dramatically. What had once slipped through defenses in alarming numbers was now intercepted with unprecedented efficiency. For the civilians below, the difference was measured not in statistics, but in nights survived. The fuse crossed oceans as easily as it crossed battlefields. In the Pacific, American forces faced a different kind of nightmare. At Battle of Iwo Jima and Battle of Okinawa, Japanese aircraft, especially kamikazes, threatened the fleet with relentless determination. Ships bristled with anti-aircraft guns, but speed, angle, and chaos often favored the attacker. Again, the proximity fuse changed the equation. VT-fused shells created invisible walls of steel around ships. Aircraft that might have survived near misses were torn apart in mid-air. Sailors watching from the decks often never knew why one attack failed and another succeeded. They only knew that some days more ships came home than expected. By the time the war ended, it was clear that something larger than a single weapon had been created. After 1945, the proximity fuse did not fade into obsolescence. It evolved. The core idea, using electronics to sense distance and choose the optimal moment to detonate, proved endlessly adaptable. What began as a tiny radio device inside an artillery shell became the conceptual foundation for modern weapons design. Missiles that exploded near aircraft, bombs that adjusted their burst height, sensors that made decisions faster than any human ever could. The scientists who had worked in Maryland, many of them at institutions linked to Johns Hopkins University, had done more than solve a wartime problem. They had established a paradigm. Weapons could think, in limited ways, for themselves. That idea never went away. Today, nearly every precision-guided weapon in the American arsenal carries the DNA of the VT fuse. Radar-guided missiles, proximity-detonated air defenses, smart munitions that strike targets from hundreds of miles away with terrifying accuracy. All descend conceptually from that simple realization proven in 1944, that electronics could make weapons not just more powerful, but smarter. The snowy forests of Belgium were not just a battlefield, they were a laboratory. There, under fog and falling snow, the future of warfare revealed itself, not in a flash of genius, but in quiet effectiveness. A solution that worked, a principle that endured. The VT fuse did not win the war by itself. No single invention ever does, but it marked a turning point, a moment when modern warfare crossed an invisible line. From that point on, victory would belong not only to those who fought bravely, but to those who understood physics, mastered systems, and built tools that turned knowledge into decisive force. That legacy still surrounds us. It hums inside circuits, It listens, measures, and decides. And it began with a device no larger than a walnut, falling silently through a winter sky. Why this story matters. Why does this story still matter 80 years later? Because the VT fuse was not just a clever weapon. It was a warning, quiet, impersonal, and profound, about the kind of world modern war was becoming. World War II did not simply decide borders. It changed the nature of conflict. Radar replaced eyesight. Cryptography replaced intuition. Jet engines outran propellers. Atomic physics ended centuries of assumptions about power and distance. Again and again, traditional military virtues, bravery, endurance, experience, were confronted by forces that did not care how courageous a soldier was, or how much he believed in his cause. That transformation has only accelerated. Today's battlefields stretch far beyond foxholes. Decisions are made in control rooms and data centers. Targets are struck by precision-guided weapons launched from continents away. The soldier is still there, but he is no longer alone. He is part of a system so complex that no single person can fully see it, let alone control it. Yet beneath all that technology, the human element remains, and so does human tragedy. The young men of the Hitlerjugend were not born as symbols of evil. They were children once, students, sons. They were shaped, methodically, relentlessly, by an environment that taught them what to believe and what to hate. They were told that faith and willpower could overcome anything, that devotion would defeat material strength, that history belonged to those who believed most fiercely. They fought with courage, they endured suffering, and they died for a cause that did not deserve their lives. Their deepest tragedy was not just that they were killed, but that they were misled. They discovered too late that modern war was no longer a contest of souls or slogans. It was a contest of systems, of logistics, of physics, of production lines and laboratories. The force that destroyed them had no face, no ideology, no hatred, only equations and circuitry obeying the laws of nature. That is what the invisible killer represents. It is the moment when human will collides with technological reality and loses. The moment when belief meets mathematics. The moment when ideology is brought to a physics problem. And that lesson reaches far beyond 1944. This story is also about America, but not the simplified version we sometimes prefer. Not the story where courage alone conquers all obstacles. The real story is more complex and more honest. America won World War II through courage and calculation, through sacrifice and systems, through young men freezing in foxholes, and through engineers, scientists, and factory workers who never heard a shot, fired but saved countless lives. At Elsenborn Ridge, American infantry stood their ground against overwhelming odds and refused to break. They deserve every word of honor given to them. But so do the men and women in laboratories and workshops, in places like Maryland, who turned theory into survival. They worked with vacuum tubes and radio waves, with test benches and chalkboards, with ideas that, once released, changed the battlefield forever. They helped defeat one of history's most evil regimes, not with speeches or slogans, but with understanding. They did it quietly. They did it efficiently. They did it with an invisible killer that fell silently from the sky. And that is why this story still matters, because it reminds us that the future is shaped not only by what we believe, but by what we build, what we understand, and how wisely we choose to use it. Voices across time. If you could stand invisibly among German soldiers that Christmas Eve morning, what would you see? Young men mostly. Boys who never knew a world without Hitler. Veterans who had survived unimaginable horrors. Fathers thinking of children they might never see again. They served evil. Many committed terrible acts. But they were also human, and in their final moments of confidence, They probably felt what soldiers always feel before battle: fear, excitement, hope of survival, belief, however misguided, that what they did mattered. Then the sky exploded above them, and the world they understood ceased to exist. On the other side, American soldiers waited in their own foxholes with their own fears. They did not know about the VT fuze. They only knew they had been told to hold this ground. They held it. The invisible killer helped them hold it. But technology alone did not win. The courage of men who kept fighting despite exhaustion and cold and fear, that mattered too. Perhaps that is the real lesson. Technology and courage are not opposites. They are partners in warfare's brutal arithmetic. The side with both defeats the side with only one. America had both in December 1944. Germany had only courage. The invisible killer did its work. The German offensive collapsed. Hitler's last gamble failed in frozen Belgian forests. The men who died there have been gone for generations. The snow that soaked their blood has melted and fallen countless times. The forests regrew. The craters filled. The foxholes collapsed into gentle depressions. But the story remains. Technology and courage. Physics and fanaticism. An invisible killer and the men it killed. The VT fuze was just the beginning. The future it promised has become our present. The questions it raised about war and technology remain. The future of warfare had already been written in laboratories, not on battlefields. Dietrich learned this lesson. He paid for it with an army. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of World War II's most remarkable and least known stories. If you enjoyed this account, please like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these forgotten narratives to light. Where are you watching from today? What other World War II stories should we cover next? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We explore history through the eyes of those who lived it. German commanders discovering why courage could not defeat systems. American soldiers understanding that wars are won in factories, not just on battlefields. Subscribe for more untold stories of World War II. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next video. Until next time, remember, history is not just about what happened, it is about understanding why. This account draws on historical records of the Battle of the Bulge and the development of the proximity fuze. Specific dialogue and internal thoughts attributed to individuals represent reasonable imaginings based on documented circumstances rather than verified quotations. Technical details of the VT fuze are based on historical documentation of the weapon's development and deployment.